My dad has a client that owns a number of fast food restaurants. One day we were working at one of his stores and talking about some robberies. The client had told us that when he was just getting into the fast food business, he lived in Colorado. He was an assistant manager at a chain that required him to wear a tie. A drug addict came into the restaurant to rob them and then grabbed him from behind, putting a knife up to his throat. He opened the register and the guy attempted to slit his throat anyway, except the knife was dull and he couldn't cut through the material of the tie. The client began to fight back and then escaped with minor injuries. That very same addict ended up going to prison, and apparently he still has that tie in a frame at his home. I was a bouncer at a club in Los Angeles for a minute in the 90s. I stopped a couple of dudes that were clearly affiliated in a gang at the door after they refused security checks. After a couple of minutes of their threats, they left spewing all sorts of crazy warnings at me. A little while later, it starts to wind down, and because it's a little slow and we're overstaffed, I start to drink. I get a little bit drunk, not wasted but kind of just sleepy buzzed. So I tell my buddy that I'm going to go lay down in the back of his car for a while. A couple of minutes after laying down, I realize I have to take a piss. I get out and kind of stumble a few into a spot between a guard gate and a building for a little bit of privacy. I'm about 25 feet away from the club's entrance and just off in the alleyway. While I'm relieving myself and doing my thing, this dude runs right past in front of me, around the guard booth to my rear, and then unloads a 9mm into the back seat of the car that I just crawled out of. It was about 4 loud shots unloading into the car. The man then turns, runs right back past me, and then down into the alley into the night. I don't think he saw me at all. Nothing really came of this afterwards, except my partner was convinced that I was a marked man and absolutely refused to be near me for about a year or so. I'm really glad that I didn't end up getting shot. It's absolutely chilling to me to think what would have happened if I wouldn't have gotten out of that car when I did.
I was reading a story on this subreddit that reminded me of an event from over 20 years ago. In the second half of 1998, I had taken a job as a security guard at a plant that made locks. Being a kid, I usually worked one of 3 shifts: 4 p.m. to 12 a.m., 7:30 p.m. to 3:30 a.m., or 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. The 7:30 to 3:30 shift was just for extra coverage, so there were always 2 of us from 7:30 to midnight. It was a routine, boring job for the most part. We did our rounds, logged anything out of the ordinary, and watched a tiny monitor displaying the CCTV feed. Things went by in an almost painfully normal manner for 6 months. I worked, saved, bought a car, and planned to move. By late March of '99, I served my notice and prepared to head cross country. A new hire was brought in to fill my spot, a soft-spoken man named Calvin. As part of his training, Calvin spent time working at all hours. At night he was a shadow, working with myself and the other night guard, getting a feel for the plant's nocturnal routines. Most nights, he worked with myself and Amira, a female guard who was around my age. I was 18 at the time. Calvin, who was about a decade older, was quiet and polite, though something seemed to be missing. There's a spark that genuinely nice people seem to have, and he didn't possess it. Whenever he went on rounds with me, he'd ask questions about the job and make small talk. I noticed that he was a little odd, laughing at odd times and changing his tone mid-sentence. At the time, I chalked it up to him being awkward. That wouldn't last. One night, near the end of his first week, he went on rounds with Amira. When they returned to the office, I knew something was wrong. Normally talkative, she would barely say a word. Not sure what occurred, I waited until Calvin had gone to the restroom to ask. During their trip, everything had been normal until they reached the brass mill, a portion of the plant that shut down at 6 p.m. There were usually no employees there after that time, and no lights. They were making their way to a checkpoint on a landing atop a flight of stairs when the mood shifted. She told me that she turned around only to find that he was right on top of her. Startled, she backed against the grating at the end of the landing, and he leaned in towards her, his face nearly touching hers. He flirted with her in a low voice, and when she mentioned his wedding band, he said that it would be over soon. From then on, I did the rounds, taking Calvin with me each time. The night ended without further incident, and I left a note for our supervisor detailing what had happened. The next night came and went with no Calvin. I did the rounds, while Amira stayed in the locked office. Same thing the night after. Then, on my second to last shift, I come in to find her freaking out. She found out why Calvin hadn't been at work. He had been arrested for murdering his wife. She had been dismembered and burned, parts of her body placed in a pond less than a mile from where we worked. That night and the next, Amira called the jail just to make sure they were still holding him. Based on the time frame, he had killed his wife months before he started the job. Many years ago when I was 13, I was visiting with a friend at his house. We'll call him Bob. Along with another friend of his. We'll call him Rick. We were the only ones home during the time. During our visit, we were doing normal bullshit that 13-year-olds do, like playing Xbox, shooting Nerf guns at each other, and things like that. Both Bob and Rick regularly attended church, and even went to a Christian private school. They were both relatively sheltered, and weren't the type of kids to pull pranks or be mischievous. Late in the afternoon, I was bullshitting with Rick while Bob was playing video games about 10 feet away. And then Rick decided that he would try and make a pentagram so that he could summon the spirit of his dog who had recently died. He told me that he had read about it somewhere and wanted to try it. I was, and still am, open-minded yet skeptical, so I watched as he proceeded to do his thing. I watched as Rick took a bunch of Nerf darts and formed a pentagram shape on the floor. He then said whatever words that were required to complete the ritual, and as soon as he was finished, an alarm in the house immediately started blaring. The three of us were a bit freaked out, and Rick destroyed the pentagram. We then ran outside and chilled for about an hour or so. It took the alarm approximately a half hour to stop blaring. Bob was my neighbor, so I went over to his house hundreds of times over the course of my childhood, and I never heard an alarm go off that sounded like that one. It almost sounded like an electronic telephone ringing one non-stop tone. When we all eventually went back inside, night had fallen. The three of us started playing Halo and chalked it up to a weird coincidence. After a couple of hours, I convinced Rick to try and make a pentagram again to see if we could replicate what had happened earlier. He obliged and again made a pentagram out of the Nerf darts in the same spot as before. During both of these events, Rick and I were standing right next to each other by the pentagram, and Bob was about 10 feet away in plain sight playing video games. Once again, as soon as Rick was finished forming a pentagram and said the magic words, the same alarm went off. We all three again ran outside and waited until the alarm went silent, which again took about half an hour. We were all pretty weirded out by it, and we decided not to try to do it again. Bob was noticeably freaked out, and Rick was also in disbelief that it had actually done anything. We decided among the three of us to not talk about it with anyone else, lest others would think we were just making up stories. It took me about 2 years to finally tell anyone else about it, and at this point, I've told anyone who's willing to listen, so I can try to get a better understanding about what happened. I remember going home that night, paranoid that a spirit would haunt me, but nothing of the sort ever happened. Bob is still in contact, but has since moved away, and I haven't seen Rick in about 8 years. I brought this up with Bob a few years ago, and I asked if he remembered. I described it to him, and he confirmed that it did in fact happen the exact same way I remember, but he didn't seem to want to talk about it, so I didn't press it. Since this happened, I've become much more interested in the unknown. If anyone can lead any additional insight on what may have caused this to happen, I would really appreciate it. I live in a small city in Romania, around 30,000 inhabitants. Romania isn't exactly known for their tolerance of gay people. It's not as bad as other places, such as Russia, but the situation is definitely not rosy here either. I get on Grindr and I meet this guy. He's 18 years old apparently. The guy didn't have a picture of his face as his PFP because it's too dangerous. He had a picture of a rose drawing. Most guys on Grindr here don't have pictures of themselves. We talked for a bit, and I really liked the guy, and then we finally agreed to exchange face pictures. I sent him a selfie of myself, and he sends me a picture of a guy that I'd seen around our city. He was cute, and I really like him. So I told him, "Hey, I see you around the city all the time. I didn't know you were gay too." We talked and finally arranged to meet. I had some errands to run at the tailor shop. My cousin's bachelorette party is coming next week, and I had to adjust my favorite shirt, so I asked him to meet me in front of the tailor shop. The building in which the tailor shop is located has 4 stories. The ground floor is a clothes shop, which my aunt works at. The first floor is a storage facility. The 3rd floor is a barber salon, and the 4th floor was a tailor shop. I go to the tailor shop, and then go to the clothes shop on the ground floor to visit my aunt and see how she's doing. As I'm looking out the window of the clothes shop, I notice that there are 5 guys, all of them in their late 20s, behind the building. None of them was the guy I had the picture of, and none of them even looked remotely close to what the guy looked like. I text the guy I was supposed to meet and ask him if he's made it to the tailor shop. As soon as I send the message, one of the 5 guys' phones lights up, and he started texting. As soon as he stopped texting, I get a notification from Grindr. I'm behind the tailor shop. I went there to smoke so no one would see me. Come smoke with me, winky face. I was terrified as I realized I wasn't going to meet the guy in the picture. He tries again to get me to go behind the tailor shop, and I try to get him to go to the side of it. There were no windows to the side of the building, so after a few tries, he agreed to meet me at the side. All 5 guys went to the side of the building. I peeked my head from the door, looked left and right, and as soon as I saw the coast was clear, I made a run for it. So, Grindr cutie, let's not meet. This happened to my dad roughly 30 years ago. My dad had been out at work all day and was cold, wet, and tired, and finally on his way home. We had some close family friends that lived about a mile away from us at the time. My dad is driving home, and he's on 20th Street, getting very close, perhaps less than a mile from our house. Now, both of our families live off of 20th, but in different neighborhoods. The route my dad took home that night would have taken him past our friend's neighborhood first. As he's sitting at the intersection nearest our friend's neighborhood, waiting for the light, he suddenly gets this very strange and overwhelming urge to stop at their house first. Why? He's cold, wet, tired, and hungry. He's had a long day. He just wants to go home. But this feeling is too strong to ignore, so when the light turns green, he drives down the street and turns off into their neighborhood. He gets to their house and, as usual, he just walks in. The way their house is set up, there's a short entry hall that then opens up on the left to the living room. A few feet further in on the right is the hallway where the bedrooms are. Straight ahead is the dining room. Through the dining room and to the left is the kitchen, and through the kitchen is the family room. So my dad walks in and stops. Then, off to the right down the hall, he hears a strange voice. It's not very loud, so he turns to look. At the end of the dark hallway, he sees my godbrother, Jerry, who is a year and a half old or so, sitting on the floor with his back to the wall facing my dad. My dad walks toward him and is trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Why is he down here all by himself? What's this noise he's making? He finally gets close enough to realize that Jerry's choking. So my dad grabs Jerry and starts skip hopping. My dad is an amputee and can't run. The best he can do is kind of quick skip hop toward the end of the house, yelling for Jerry's parents. He gets Jerry to the kitchen, grabs him by the ankles, and holds him upside down over the sink. Jerry's pretty purpley blue by this point. Jerry's parents, who had been in the family room, came running. They're confused and scared, and my dad whacks Jerry in the back in an attempt to dislodge whatever is causing him to choke. Nothing happens. He turns to Jerry's dad and says, "If his ribs break, I don't want to be the one to break them. Hit him. Hard." So Jerry's dad hauls off and whacks him on the back, and out comes a rock. Thankfully, no ribs were broken. So, Jerry starts breathing again. Everyone's calming down, and Jerry's dad says to my dad, "Where the hell did you come from?" My dad just kind of shook his head and told him about the feeling he had. To this day, he is still amazed by the whole thing.
Okay, so I'm using a throwaway account because it got some pretty big media. I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I was representing this guy that had embezzled almost $500,000 from his business partner. He was looking down at the barrel at several years in prison. A bunch of his assets had been seized by the government. He was being sued by multiple creditors for north of $2 million, and was in the midst of an ugly divorce and wasn't allowed to see his kids. I happened to be one of the 3 lawyers that he had: criminal, civil, and divorce. He was drinking a lot and using coke. I used to get this incoherent phone calls in the middle of the night that ranged from threats to crying. One day he came to my office and asked for me, but I wasn't there and I was in court at the time. My secretary said that he was being perfectly civil at the time. After that, he then went to his divorce lawyer's office and then shot him to death. He got stopped by the police a short distance away and he was wounded in a shootout. He would later end up telling the cops that he came to my office to shoot me that day as well, and also had planned to shoot his civil attorney too. Yeah, I really dodged a bullet that day. Literally. I have a friend who had a party at his parents' house when he was in high school that a ton of random people went to. He got super drunk during the party and then went upstairs to go take a nap, knowing that his friends would probably watch the party for him. My friend woke up from his nap to a guy from his high school sitting on top of him, stabbing him to death. He was stabbed about 7 times before it was stopped, and he just laid there on the bed, just dying. The only reason he's still alive is because one of his best friends came upstairs to ask if it was alright if he made a frozen pizza, and that's when he found his friend just lying there in a bloody pool. The assailant was put in jail and recently released, and it absolutely scares me to know that that guy who wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone is still out there free. I was abducted at a gas station during undergrad. The locks on my car were broken, and as soon as I got back in, there was a strange man that came in and then forced me to drive him to an ATM. I'm absolutely paralyzed with fear, so any sense or reason that I had just totally went out the window. He claimed that he worked at a Wendy's, and for my generosity, he would give me all the Wendy's that I would ever want. On the way to the ATM, he showed me pictures of his daughters, which were clearly on a stolen cell phone. Then a Whitney Houston song came on the radio, and he just starts bawling his eyes out and screaming, "Why do all the good people have to die? Bad things should only happen to bad people." I go to the ATM, take out the cash, give it to him, thinking it's over, and then he makes me get back in the car and drive him somewhere else. We pass by some train tracks, and I'm just thinking that this is it. This is where I'm going to die. He asks me what I'm studying in school, and I tell him biochemistry. "I believe in jet propulsion and all that crap. We're not alone. Aliens are among us." That's what he said to me. He makes me pull over at a gas station, and then he tells me, "Drive away, sweetheart. Get out of here." After that, I called the cops and I had to do a lineup. Apparently this dude had done this to a ton of other women, and some of them were less unscathed than I was. I was an 18-year-old female back when this happened. I'm now 25. I was on my way home at nighttime after meeting with a friend. My home was just about 10 minutes away from the train station. After a few minutes, I felt someone following me. No big deal, I thought, just someone else walking home as well. But I started walking faster. I realized that the person behind me was starting to catch up. Weird. In my head, I started to make up scenarios of how to defend myself if the person were to attack me. Now, never would I think of this to actually happen to me. Well, until I felt something on the back of my head hitting me really hard. I went furious. I turned around and then attacked the guy. My mind was just full of anger towards this random stranger who what I thought that hit me. We were wrestling until I fell hard on the ground. He was sitting on top of me, strangling me. I tried to dig my nails deep into his eyes as deep as I could, but I started to black out. Suddenly, there was this thought in my head. You need to wake up or you're going to die here." Well, adrenaline kicked in yet again, and I opened my eyes and then screamed at the top of my lungs, once more attacking him. That helped. The man then stood up and began to run away. I kind of just laid there on the ground for a few seconds before I started to run back home, still screaming. My mom was already at our door and opened the door for me because my screams were so loud that they woke her up. My mom immediately called the cops so that they could arrest him on the same night. As it turns out, the man actually shot me in the head from behind. They assumed that the gun didn't work properly as the bullet didn't penetrate my skull and just stuck in there. But as far as I know, they never found out why the gun misfired. I'm really glad though. The man told the cops that he had already followed me a few times in the past, but he had never had the guts to go through with it. This isn't even the worst part of the story. Apparently, he told the police that not only did he want to kill me, but he also wanted to rape my dead body. I'm very fortunate to have survived this, and it's probably the most terrifying thing that's happened to me to date. Please everyone, be safe out there and always watch your surroundings.